Tonight I'm going to talk about Chapter 6 from the book Ground Path and Fruition by Tai Situ Rinpoche. This chapter is on meditation. He starts out by saying that in the next chapter, next two chapters, he's going to be talking about the five skandhas and the four noble truths. And these are all connected, or interconnected, if you prefer that term. But tonight he is talking about meditation. And he goes into this very deeply, but this actually does not speak too much about the actual technique. But this will come to that in a little while here. So he says that Dharma practice is threefold, that we learn, we do things physically and orally, chanting, for instance, reciting mantra, and we meditate. And we meditate to make learning meaningful. To make learning meaningful, it has to be implemented. That's a quote on page 195. And so this is the doing things physically and with our voice, as well as meditating, is implementing the teachings. That the Kagyus are called the practice lineage, and practice is essential to all of the other Tibetan lineages as well. But the Kagyus and the Nyingmas really stress practice more than the other two. And so practice is really important to implement the teachings, to understand the teachings. And he uses the example of a patient and a doctor in medicine, and that for the medicine to be effective, you have to take it. It's that simple. So the medicine is learning about the Dharma, learning about the practices, and taking it is the implementation, both the physical and the verbal, and then mental, that we habituate to positive actions, and we develop patterns or habits to avoid negative actions. We diminish our negative habitual patterns and we develop positive habitual patterns. So this is the first part of implementation, but this part is external, that without meditation, which is internal, they are very slow and there's very little internal development. He uses the story about the bandit in old Tibet that would do mantra while he was waiting for a caravan to arrive. And then, of course, when the caravan was spotted, everybody would get on their horse and go out and rob the caravan. So he talked about this reciting the mantra Om Mani Padme Hung as being a cultural habit, but a very shallow habit. So we need to develop these habits at a very deep level for them to have a significant impact on us. And that's where meditation comes in. So on page 200, he said, meditation, looking inward, is by definition using your mind to recognize the true potential of your mind. And there are different kinds of meditation, which again, we're going to touch on here a little bit. But he starts out with this section by telling a story of a trader who would have been an object of this bandit to rob, who he was in one of these caravans coming back probably from India or Nepal, and they were hungry, and he went out and he shot a deer, and he realized as the deer ran away and he chased after it following the blood, and it was pregnant, and a baby deer came out of the wound on the side of the deer, and he realized how much suffering he caused by killing this deer, shooting it. And he abandoned the caravan, abandoned his belongings, and he went to the monastery, received teachings on Chenrezig, and then went to a cave to practice. And the cave overlooked a large river. And in the morning, he would be seen on the cliff on one side of the river, and in the evening, he would be seen on a cliff on the other side of the river. And there was no possible way of crossing over. There wasn't a bridge, there weren't boats. And but he did this regularly. And the explanation that the high lamas in the area gave was that this was due to his meditation practice. And this is understanding it, realizing it at a very deep internal level. And another story that he told in this section was about the white bird Llama, who again was just meditating by himself in a cave and had no really care about his clothes, his surroundings, and everything. And eventually his clothes just disintegrated, fell apart, and he had nothing to wear. And so birds would land on him and cover his body. Now, Tai Situ Rinpoche says that these are things that happened not that long ago, before the Chinese invasion. I think he said roughly 100 years ago, would have been the early 20th century. But again, later on, towards the end of the chapter, he says, now these stories are done for a very single purpose. And so remember the purpose of the story. And the purpose of the story is the results that you get from studying the Dharma, learning the Dharma, chanting, using your body in these practices, both meditation and chanting and pujas. And then by meditating and looking inward, all of this is what is the result of that. So specifically getting into meditation, he talks about shamatha and vipassana. And he doesn't talk too much about the Hinayana version of shamatha and vipassana. He goes right to starting with Mahayana. And then he talks about Vajrayana. So in the Mahayana, shamatha is focusing on the emptiness of everything. the insubstantiality of everything, that everything appears as an illusion, and letting go of it. And the Vipassana aspect is to focus on the clarity. And so this you could easily apply to any of the pujas that we chant here. Chenrezig, Amitabha, Medicine Buddha, White Tara, Green Tara, and so forth. That we have these focus on visualizing these deities, but they're made out of light, they're not solid. They're clear, but they are mere appearance. They are made out of light. In the Vajrayana, he describes shamatha as settling, and Vipassana is manifesting. He uses the example of Mahamudra practice in this aspect here, that Mahamudra is, quote, a direct meditation on the nature of mind, end quote. So it is allowing the mind to settle down and then resting in the nature of mind manifesting. And he says that this is actually the highest form of Vipassana meditation. He says that in the Nyingma tradition, they have Dzogchen, and basically the meaning is the same for Dzogchen as he's using here for Mahamudra. They're very similar, but there are differences too between the Nyingma practice of Dzogchen and the Kagyu practice of Mahamudra. But both of them are very profound and are the highest practice in their lineages, individual lineages. So in order to do these very profound forms of Vipassana, you need a very profound form of shamatha. He says that frequently shamatha is described as calm abiding, and this is attained by concentrating on the breath or another object of the senses. And when done properly, the thoughts become secondary. That the thoughts are, I guess, our attachment to the thoughts weakens, and we can watch the thoughts come and go and not try to hold on to them, keep them from disappearing. And the Vipassana aspect is maintaining clear awareness, being aware of being aware of the breath, or being aware of thoughts are coming and going. He uses or he explains the experience that you can sometimes have when reading a book to be similar to this, that if it's a really interesting book to you, you can get, quote, lost, end quote, reading the book, kind of forget about time. Just keep on reading. And that would be shamatha. The Vipassana aspect would be that the meaning becomes clear as you read. You're not just reading words, you're understanding the words very clearly. In contrast to that, he talks about a mind that is not calm, is discursive and neurotic. Quote, we build our own torture chamber, end quote. This is on page 201. And we don't do this intentionally, but this is what happens with this discursiveness and neurosis. And it might be helpful to understand a little bit about what neurosis or neurotic means. It means that you can have compulsive behavior. You can have rapid changes in emotional states. You are mildly out of touch with reality, at least in terms of Western psychology. But this neurosis, this failure to see things as they are, and then piling on to our experience, self and other, and all kinds of attachments, aversions, and so on and so forth. This is how we build samsara, and this is why we suffer. He uses the analogy of a cocoon and a silkworm, that a silkworm creates a cocoon made out of the silk fiber that they produce with their own body. And since human beings find that thread to be a very desirable, and they do not want to have the thread cut short, which would happen if the larvae comes out as a moth that has to chew its way out. And so they put the cocoons in boiling water to kill the larvae. So we create, this analogy goes this way, that we create our own cocoons from the 5 poisons. And his phrase is, and then we are cooked in the suffering of samsara, because the 5 poisons lead to more and more and more suffering. So shamatha helps us see this. Shamatha helps us see that we have built, you might say, a cocoon. Sometimes people talk about boxes or silos, or you could even say bunkers, that beings in samsara create a very small claustrophobic world that they live in, and there are very few possibilities, and it's just permeated with suffering. But if we can start seeing this, how it happens, the mechanism, and realizing that we are the ones that have created these cocoons, or whatever you want to use, that we stop making them. We start feeling claustrophobic and wanting to get out. We can become motivated by genuine compassion and devotion. And this is a very important point, that we need to have compassion towards ourselves and disgust for the afflictive states of mind, disgust for ego clinging, proving our ego. And it's important to remember that we are not our afflictions, that our afflictions are temporary and superficial, but this is not our essence. So he then goes into a discussion of this text by Atisha Dipamkara. The text is "The Precious Lamp of the Path to Liberation." And this talks about meditation. So to start out with, when he goes into meditation specifically here, is that we need to cut back on the causes and the conditions of discursiveness. That preparing for meditation begins before you even go into the shrine room and sit on the cushion. That and we have to look at meditation as being something that is a practice that we do that helps us along the path to complete enlightenment. And without that, the meditation can become simply stress management. You could say, he is an example of losing weight and then eating and gaining it back, and then losing it and eating and gaining the weight back, and so forth. But you could also say that an incorrect approach to meditation would be to look at it a bit like a vacation, the weekend, where when you're meditating, you have been able to let go of at least a little bit certain thoughts that cause you stress. And as you let go of these, you feel better, more relaxed, and so forth. But then Monday comes around and you go to work and it's back to the same old, same old. And it was really just a temporary vacation, that there was no long-term benefit from it. So he talks about we need to work with our defilements. And that he uses the example here now of a fire, that the defilements are like a fire and our negative actions are like fuel. And so if we are going to have a good meditation practice, we need to cut back on our non-virtuous actions, the 10 non-virtuous actions, and engage more of the 10 virtuous actions, which are basically the opposite of the 10 non-virtuous actions. So this is a very important point. If the rest of your life is a mess, then meditation is not going to make a huge difference. It may help you manage the stress, but there's no significant change. And I have noticed this when I have led meditation, that some people tend to smile when they meditate. And well, that might be a sign of a good shamatha meditation and resting in peace and calmness. It also can be an indication of being attached to the feel-good experience that you can have as your body and your mind relax. And it's more of a mundane meditation rather than one that leads you along the path to realization. He says that we're all beginners, that it's really important that there are problems if we look at ourselves as expert and aren't quite as expert as we think we are, and that it's much better to view ourselves as beginners. Quote, in the beginning, we are by definition beginners. We are not mature, grounded, or developed. That's on page 206. That if we jump ahead and do things that we're not really ready to do, this can be a huge obstacle. And there's nothing wrong with repetition. It's not a problem to begin again. So beginners, their minds are fresh, open. They're full of space. It's full of room. An expert's mind is actually not much room there because he's an expert. He already knows. And I'm going to say, quote unquote, knows. And there isn't much learning that happens if after you reach the point where you figure you know that you are no longer a beginner. So it's actually very good to approach meditation and Dharma practice with the mind of a beginner. So starting with the viewpoint of a beginner, he talks about requirements for meditation practice. And the first one is an environment that is conducive to meditation. Have a room or a space set aside that you will not be disturbed in by other humans or non-humans that live in the same area that you live in. It's good to have the area, if not your whole house or apartment, organized, clean, free of clutter, and to have peaceful relationships with the other humans that are living with you. If there is stress in your relationships, that can make it much more difficult for your mind to settle down. The second point he makes here is to be content with what you have. To try to be as content as possible with what you have. So he's got three things that he talks about in this section. The one is cut down on greed for things, desire for things. He uses the analysis of examining in terms of what I have, what I want, and what I need. And a lot of times what we need, we already have. And a lot of what we have, we don't need. And it's just sitting around. So it's important to examine our possessions from time to time and examine our habits of shopping or bringing more things home. The second part here is to cut down on unnecessary activities, to use your time efficiently. That it's fine to have interests, hobbies, ambitions, goals, and so on and so forth, but examine them carefully, use your time wisely, prioritize, and if possible, cut some, or at least cut the amount of time you spend on them, so that you are not so rushed and hurried. It's a very busy culture that we live in. It could be busier. It could be less busy, but the point is that we are the ones that ultimately control how we spend our day, how much time we spend doing various things. In terms of comparison, I was in Taiwan a while ago, and one, excuse me, one, so I was in Taiwan, and one person that lived there told me that I don't hesitate to call up a friend at 11 o'clock at night because I know they will be awake. That this is just the way things are here in Taiwan. And I spent over a week staying at this one temple where they had some living quarters, and my room had a window up on probably the third floor, and it overlooked the park. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, the park was full of people. Most of them were in small groups, and they were doing things like Tai Chi and other forms of group activity, exercise. And by 7 o'clock, the parks were empty. The parking lots were empty. I went over there one time at noon, and again, it was totally empty. Beautiful park, but totally empty. People were too busy working. But they did not have playground equipment there in this park. They had exercise equipment. Everything was for people to use to exercise with. So it might seem like we have an extremely fast culture, but in Taiwan, I believe it's even faster than here. And the bottom line is we can't say other people are keeping us from using our time more wisely, or that the culture is keeping us from using our time more wisely. In some cases, people would come to Rinpoche and he would say, well, then you need to change jobs if your job is keeping you that busy and you want to have more time for practice. The third point is to cut down the number of ideas that are going through your mind. And he found different categories here. He said some of my ideas aren't my business. Some are my business, but somebody else is doing it. And some just plain don't need to be done. So our minds can be very active, but again, we don't have to just follow our thoughts around. That we can, you might say, take back control over what we look into and what we let go of. Then he says we need to avoid negative companions. And as you progress along the path, this opens up. But here he says that since we are all really more at the beginner level, we need to avoid people with bad habits, people that are reckless. He used the word ruthless, non-compassionate, neurotic. That it would be wonderful if we could, by associating with them, bring them up. But it is more likely that they will drag us down. But we can pray for them, we can dedicate merit to them, and so forth. So it's important for us to remember that we are beginners and that we have to be careful. He says, for us, the end does not justify the mean. He talks about a previous lifetime of the Buddha that the Buddha recalled, where he was a sailor and there was another sailor on the ship that was going to sink the ship and kill everybody. And the Buddha killed that man to save the lives of 400 to 500 people. And by killing the man, he also kept the man from accumulating the karma of killing 400 to 500 people. So he engaged in a negative action of killing a person, but for good motivation. He says we are not at that place, and here we have to examine carefully. Stop, and you might say put the pause button, because if we're considering something negatively, we need to pause and examine it very, very, very carefully before proceeding. So these are the points that he makes about preparing for shamatha meditation. He says, quote, how not to fuel the fire of neurosis or defilement, end quote. Now he goes into the actual practice here. And even that, he might say, he has a little bit of an introduction here. He says that we have to realize that our minds are Buddha, perfect and limitless. But in the relative world, they are very, very limited. That we don't have much of a clue of the ultimate nature of our mind because we've never recalled experiencing it. And he talks a little bit then about mundane shamatha, starting with the human realm and then going up through the God realms, the desire realm, the form, and then the formless realms. And in the mundane world, the end of this path of mundane shamatha is a state of total cessation. I looked at the glossary on this point, and I thought I would just read you what the glossary says, because it's quite precise. So this is on page 332, and it says, it's talking about these 3 realms of samsara. You've heard me talk about the 6 realms of samsara. Well, here it's divided up a little differently into 3 realms. So, quote, these are the 3 categories of samsara. The desire realm includes existences where beings are reborn with coarse bodies due to their karma, ranging from the Deva paradises to the hell realms. The form realm is where beings are born due to the power of meditation, and their bodies are of subtle form. These are the meditation paradises. The formless realm is where beings are born after achieving very refined meditative states in their previous life. Being born in the formless realm means their process of thoughts and perception ceases. So that is a little more than was in that chapter, and I hope helps explain things a little bit better. So when we're doing shamatha, we want to make sure that we are doing it in a way which leads to liberation rather than leads to just cessation in the mundane world of samsara. The physical posture, no matter what the technique is that we're doing, is basically the same. It's called the 7-point posture of Vairochana. Rinpoche gives slightly different instructions. This is more of a general outline. So first, sitting cross-legged on a cushion, and then having your hands on your knees or like Amitabha in your lap. Rinpoche would have you curl your ring fingers around your thumb and make a gentle fist and place them on your legs. So the first is crossing the legs. The second has to do with the position of the hands. The third is to have a straight back and spine. The fourth point is to have the shoulders spread out like a vulture's wing. So it'd be like this, keeping the chest out. Then having the chin lowered and then the jaw lowered a little bit. The tip of the tongue is touching the upper palate behind the teeth. Your eye gaze is looking out past your nose. And then he adds an 8th point, which is to focus on breathing, if that's a technique that you are using, which is the most common one, following the breath going in and out. So those are the main points of the meditation posture. And finally, he makes 4 points at the end here. So there are 4 things to focus the mind on. They are part of the shamatha, quote, practice puzzle. The first is all-pervading observation. And this means that nothing is excluded from our meditation practice. Whatever arises is fresh. There's nothing that we're supposed to not think about. So this basic idea of observation is whatever arises is worth observing. The second point is he uses the phrase, a little bit of analysis. So, quote, properly observing objects we find desirous, end quote. So examine whatever we find arouses desire. And of course, there are just almost a limitless number of things it can: money, power, status. He uses antiques as an example, people, property, and so forth. So look and see what they really are. See these things as illusions of relative reality. And he says, if we look deep enough, we'll find that within these illusions, we have other illusions. It's can get quite complicated when you have 2 or 3 or 4, kind of like those Russian nesting dolls that one is inside of the other. One illusion inside of another illusion, which is inside of another illusion, and so on and so forth. It gets very complicated. And our attachments and aversions keep us addicted to samsara. The third point is being knowledgeable. He says there are many things to know in Tibetan Buddhism, and I think that's an understatement. But the most important, knowing which ones are most important. And he mentions them as being the 12 links of interdependence, prajna paramita, and then the 5 skandhas. I covered the 12 links of interdependence a little while ago in the previous book that we were following. And previously in this book, he talks about prajna paramita. And coming up then is the 5 skandhas. And the 5 skandhas are really about the development of self. The 12 links are what keep us circling it, samsara, one lifetime after another, after another. The last point here is purification, and that is that the objects that completely abandon affliction. This is focusing on the 4 Noble Truths, for instance. And this will be in a future chapter also. So it is, besides the meditation, when you're not meditating, to contemplate these things so that we can abandon what needs to be abandoned, the afflictions. the question was asked, when are you ready for starting the Vipassana or the insight meditation? And the answer is, as was brought up in the book, it depends on which jhana you are on, exactly how you would do the Vipassana. And first of all, to be on the Hinayana, you have to have taken refuge. To be on the Mahayana, you have to have taken the Bodhisattva vows. And on the Vajrayana, you need the vows of Samaya, which is a commitment to your guru, your Llama. So it partly is your commitment. What level of commitment are you willing to make? And then it would be, you might say, talking it over with your teacher, your Llama, about what you would like to pursue. With as was mentioned in the book, that on the Mahayana level, the clarity is an aspect of the Vipassana. There also are, and he did not talk about this at all. This was a very, very, very brief overview of the points. But there also are Vipassana meditations that can be done. When I taught on the 7 points of mind training, the book by Traleg Rinpoche, Lojong, the 7 points of mind training, in some of the slogans, there are slogans that lead you to a Vipassana type of investigative meditation at the Mahayana level. Now, Tai Situ Rinpoche, when he went over these slogans, he basically glossed over them. And the impression I had was that he does not want to talk about these, that he felt the people that he was talking to were not ready to hear this. To kind of round this out, because of the political situation in India, Tai Situ Rinpoche has not been able to travel to this country much at all for over a decade. And he started at KTD a program that was to meet on a yearly basis. I think it was a 5-year program on Mahamudra. And after the first year, things closed up and he couldn't travel to the United States anymore. And his students had to travel to India to attend that program. And I know a number of people that did that regularly. And there was also a very strong commitment in terms of practice with this program. If you committed to doing this program every year, 5 years in a row, that you had to do a very significant amount of practice every day at home and keep track of it. And if you fell behind, you fell behind and you had to make it up. It was very strict. So the point that I'm getting at here is that it requires a lot of diligence, being exertion and work on the part of the student to do Vipassana meditation in a structured setting. when we're doing things like Chenrezig and White Tara and so forth, there's a certain element of this in there. But if you want a real structured program, then it requires a lot of devotion and commitment. The question was raised that I'm familiar with the 6 realms, and I know I've talked about this in the past also. But here he talks about 3 realms and what's going on here. And all I can say is that this is the way the Tibetans do it. They have the 6 realms, like is in the Wheel of Life. And these are the common realms: the hell realm, the hungry ghost realm, the animal realm, the human realm, and then 2 God realms. These 3 realms are looking at the 6 realms from a slightly different perspective. And it is in terms of accomplishment of meditative shamatha stability, in terms of the mundane world, not the Buddhist world. And so all but the God realms, all but some of the higher God realms are in the desire realm. So that desire realm has all 6 of the other, the other way the pie is divided up in it. But then some of these jealous gods and gods, their meditative concentration is stronger, and their bodies are much more subtle and more beautiful, of course. And it is because of their meditative concentration that they are born with bodies like this. And then the highest realm, which is the formless realm, that is almost a state of blankness. It's a cessation of thoughts and emotions. It's not realization, but it's just a cessation. And again, to give you an idea how you can experience that in the human realm when you meditate, it would be a bit like this. You're not aware of anything. You're just thoughts, input from the senses, input from the mind. All of this has ceased. You're not experiencing anything, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's just kind of like, you might say, a fancy way of passing out. The question came up about this cutting down, specifically on the ideas that are running through your head. What about art, creativity, and so on and so forth? And it is not meant to stifle art or creativity. All you have to do is go into the KTD shrine room or any traditional Tibetan shrine room, and you will find lots of artwork, lots of sculpture, lots of painting, lots of handmade items, ritual items that are quite beautiful. And in fact, at KTD, the Buddha statue has a traditional panel that goes over the head of the Buddha and on each side. And it is handmade, and it has 12 scenes, and it depicts the 12 deeds of the Buddha. And I met the man that did that. He was French, and his family had been doing this for generations. One of their previous works of art they had done was the Statue of Liberty. And so, yes, there's room for art, but it's enough already, you know? When it's time to meditate, you know, put the art down. Don't, uh, uh, when you're meditating, don't have a pad of paper and a pencil and start sketching your next art project or writing poetry or whatever, you know. Concentrate on the meditation and leave that for later.